Let's talk supply chain. So, welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I am really happy to have you here. I mean, I'm a big fan of the content that you're putting out there for
Likewise.
an underserved market. And I'm truly curious to pick your brain on how we can work around an ultimately charged supply chain atmosphere from your negotiation and procurement perspective, right? I mean, I can tell that my appetite for this kind of conversation is growing, and I know that the audience is too. So let's go ahead and just get started. Before we get into exactly what you do at Negotiation Ninja, can we set the scene a little bit, right?
Mm.
Negotiation isn't something we hear about every day on the news or maybe in the headlines. So, what does the landscape of negotiation kind of look like right now? Why is it important to professionals, supply chain professionals?
Yeah, it's so critically important. I mean, we are living in such a strange time when it comes to supply chain shortages, blockages,
Yes.
inflationary environment, vendors going out of business, vendors consolidating, and all of that becomes really difficult to be able to navigate. And without good negotiation skills,
Hmm.
it's really hard for us to get deals that make sense for our organization. And many of
Yeah.
us are stuck in situations where we feel like we are under undue pressure from
Okay.
many of our partners and
Mhm.
from many of our vendors. And we feel like a lot of the time we're being held to cost increases or changes in the agreement that we have no influence over. But the reality is, we do have influence over at least some of it, where we
Yeah.
can make changes. So, negotiation is more important today than it ever has been before. And I'm really excited to get into the conversation with you about it.
Yeah, and I think, some of the stuff that we spoke about before we hopped on and pressed the record button is really around how, you know, negotiation really didn't come up too much pre-COVID. I mean, it did, but it really didn't. But now, like
Right.
you said, with all of the disruptions that are happening in supply chain, you're renegotiating contracts. Like you said,
Everything.
there's vendors that are going out of business, but also we're looking at supply chain very differently.
Hmm.
We're looking at ways that we can potentially diversify our supplier base, maybe buy from other suppliers in different countries, right? And I think, part of that comes free trade agreements. We need to look more at free trade agreements and see where we've got, maybe some duty relief. If we do buy from a certain country or vice versa, right? Import or export.
Right.
And that's where, and plus the prices of freight are just skyrocketing. And
Bananas.
so your Incoterms become even more important because you're negotiating what that looks like and what the cost ends up being.
Right.
And so I think, we have to, if they're not doing it right now, we have to look at everything that's happening right now. And so typically, like negotiation kind of falls under procurement, does it not, rather than supply chain?
I think that's what a lot of people believe, but I think it's primarily because supply chain folks have been so focused on getting the job done for
Yeah.
such a long time and actually just figuring out the flow of goods and inventory and logistics and all of the things that go with it that they've and really shipping rates have been fairly okay for
Right.
quite some time, and now they're completely out of control, and now we have to figure out how we're going to manage that. And
Mhm,
negotiating your inventory and negotiating your supply agreements has become super critical, and typically procurement has dealt with a lot of that stuff in the past, but now
mhm.
it's becoming more and more important for other departments to be able to get involved and to be able to manage that, because the reality is supply chain people know their business best. And so
Right.
for a procurement person to step in and talk about drayage or talk about things like marine or anything like that would be bananas, right? It doesn't make a ton of sense. It makes sense for someone who's knowledgeable about what they're doing to negotiate those things. Now, while those people may be knowledgeable about what they do, they may not necessarily be knowledgeable about how to negotiate
Right.
better deals on those things. And we
Yeah.
find this with the vast majority of disciplines that we work with, whether they're people in the field, whether they're people doing the logistics, whatever it might be. They know how it works, but they may not necessarily know how to build leverage or get more out of those deals. So I think it's really important for people to be able to enhance their negotiation knowledge, because it's not only going to help them in their business lives, it's going to help them in their personal lives too. And we're in a situation right now where even in our personal lives, costs are out of control, relationships are going crazy. Those
Yeah.
things need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because you're talking about collaboration internally. I always talk about collaboration being the future of business, both internally and externally. And so, what parties would you say need to sort of come together to really be a force when you're going into a negotiation?
Yeah, I think, look, if you can get people from the supply chain and procurement department, we already have a really good relationship with each other. So I feel like that's good. We already understand each other a little bit. We already understand what each other do. And I think we need to rely on each other a little bit more. So
Yeah.
bringing someone from procurement who's really well versed in negotiation, who has a strength in that, and really feeding them the information that they need to be successful in that negotiation and
Hmm.
being a part of that negotiation is really critical to your success in supply chain. Whether you're working with warehousing or whether you're working with inventory or whether you're working with shipping, regardless of what kind of agreements you're putting together, the procurement person is going to be able to understand very quickly where the levers might be in that
Right.
negotiation and what can be done. But a lot of people, I think, are trying to achieve things that may not necessarily be achievable. For example, I talk to supply chain and procurement people all the time, and they're like, well, we're going to try and look for cost reduction. And I say, whoa, right? Like in this kind of environment, what we're trying to do is cost control more than
Right.
anything else. We're in a
Hmm.
heavy inflationary environment. The likelihood that you're going to get any cost reduction at all is very minimal. And so, what we're trying to do is manage the cost increases as best we can and to make sure that in some sort of way we can forecast what that cost might be. So tying it to indices and tying it to things that make sense for our kind of environment is really, really important. For
Yeah,
example,
I love
fuel
that.
being a big part of that.
Yeah, and I love that you said cost control, right?
Yeah,
A lot of times when we think about procurement, we're talking about, reducing the costs. And a lot of times
right,
supply chain professionals get that kind of pressure.
right.
But right now, sort of changing that mindset as to what that needs to look like will, I think, reduce some of that pressure and make everybody sort of work better together. So, let's talk about what you do, right? Because I think you obviously, you know a lot about this and you help a lot of people with this.
Mm.
So, what exactly do you do at Negotiations Ninja and how do you help your customers?
We typically work with enterprise procurement and enterprise sales teams to teach them how to negotiate better. And what
Okay.
that means for most teams is learning how to increase profitability, either on the cost side or the revenue side, or to manage risk. Those are the two biggest areas that we focus on. But for the person that's listening right now, I want to try and make it as applicable for you as humanly possible. When you think about your negotiations on an ongoing basis, most of us are kind of just winging it in the
Right.
negotiation. We know what we're doing, right? We've done it for a really long time. We go in, we think we can get a good deal, and we come out, and the objective for our negotiations is get a good deal. But most of us don't even know what a good deal actually means
Huh.
because we haven't really
Fair.
defined what a good deal is.
Hmm.
And the only way to do that really is to fully identify and very clearly delineate before you go into the negotiation exactly what you need and exactly what you want. And those are two different things, by the way. A need is a must have requirement, and a want is a nice to have requirement. And so
Right.
many people end up walking away from deals because they didn't get all of their amazing wants, and that deal could have worked because it met all of their needs.
Right.
So I think before anyone goes into a negotiation, they first need to think about what do I need and what do I want and what is the range of acceptable outcomes on each of those needs and wants, and be very clear about that before you go in. Otherwise, there's no way to measure how successful you've actually been, and then you can never determine whether you got a good deal, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's kind of like protecting the mindset too, right?
Mhm.
If you know what success can look like in a variety of different ways, you walk away feeling so much better than when you get an outcome and you're not even sure what that even looks like for yourself
Yeah.
or for the company.
Yeah, exactly. And if if your chief supply chain officer or chief procurement officer comes up to you and says, "Hey, did you secure that deal?" and you say, "Yeah, I got a good deal." And then she says, "Prove it." You're like, I can't because you've done nothing to be able to measure your success. So trying to
Right.
be as objective as we can be about the measurable parts of that negotiation is critical.
Yeah.
So some of your needs may be to improve lead time. Some of your needs may be to increase the inventory that we have on hand. Some of your needs may be to develop an alternate supplier. It may be a number of different things that you're doing in that negotiation. And if you can't measure that, you don't know if you've been successful.
Well, and you're also measuring expectations for not only yourself, but also for the people around you.
Yeah,
And that makes that conversation a lot easier to have
right,
when you've set the expectations with them. You all know what success kind of looks like on a variety of different levels. And then everybody can walk away feeling kind of satisfied from what's happened instead of kind of in limbo, not really understanding if we got a good deal or we didn't get a good deal.
right,
um
exactly.
so all really really good tangible takeaways. How did you get into negotiation? I mean, you're a self-titled procurement veteran. Tell us a little bit about that, plus you have a podcast. So how did
Yeah.
all of this kind of come about for you?
So, started out in sales actually right out of university. Ended up paying off all my student loans, and then
Nice.
decided, hey, this is great, but I want to try the other side of the table. Then walked into the
Mm.
procurement world. Ended up working in rail, ended up working in a number of
Huh.
different environments for quite some time, and then decided, you know what, the corporate world's not really for me. I want to do my own thing, and then left and started up the Negotiations Ninja podcast, which is now the best negotiation podcast in the world. And we have a number of guests on there. Everyone from suicide hotline negotiators to hostage negotiators to procurement and sales and supply chain, telling us about their expertise. That evolved into the training business, which is what Negotiations Ninja is today. And now we train some of the largest enterprise teams on the planet.
I love that journey. I mean, when I talk to supply chain professionals, a lot of us are like, we fell into the industry. Because until a couple of years ago, we really didn't have a career path within,
Right.
post secondary education. And so I like the fact that, like me, you kind of did some operations, right? You got your hands in there, you got some real life experience, and then you've turned it into something that people need in a variety of different industries, but mainly with a focus in supply chain and procurement, which is great because
Yeah.
we really need that. And I love your podcast, so I highly recommend everybody go and check that out. And I'm going to be on it soon too. So
Yes, you are. It's going to be
um
fun. I'm excited about it.
oh, it's going to be so much fun. So one of the key issues that I think our listeners really are interested in when we talk about things like negotiation is sort of navigating a post-pandemic work environment. Now,
Mm.
you and I kind of touched on this at the beginning of the episode, but talk us through that. What do you see that has changed the most?
Man, so much has changed. I think in a specific corporate work environment, I think the biggest thing that's changed is we've conditioned people to believe that there's no requirement to be on site.
Mm, okay.
And that is really great and really bad because we've recognized a lot of cost savings as a result, but we've also changed the culture.
Right.
That's internal. Separate to that, externally with vendors, everything is being negotiated as virtually as we can now. So travel has gone down significantly, which is great for
Hmm.
people like you and me who travel a fair bit. And
Right.
now we get to do things over Zoom and Teams and Zencaster, which we're using right now. So it may, what a lot of people have experienced is they've had to adjust their negotiation style
Mm,
to a virtual environment, which for people that have been in the industry for a really long time is really challenging because a lot of us are really comfortable talking to each other one on one over the table, having a coffee, going out for a meal, playing around a golf, doing whatever we do to try and get a deal done.
hmm.
Unfortunately, that environment is very quickly diminished. We may be doing it a little bit now because restrictions have decreased, but I don't
Right.
think it's ever going to get back to the point that we were at pre
Hmm.
COVID, which means that many of us have to adjust how we communicate in a virtual setting. And a lot of us are not used to that. So I've got a few tips for the listeners about how to adjust for that in a virtual setting. Number one, remember that you are on camera.
Right.
That's really important to remember.
Are you referring to the judge and the whole cat
Yeah,
thing?
exactly. I am not a cat. Yes, we know you're not a cat.
And overly communicate, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, exactly. And that's critical, right? Because a lot of us are very uncomfortable with a digital setting. And
mhm,
that's not a bad thing. It just means that you have to really ramp up your learning curve in a big way really quickly. If you
mhm,
haven't done so already, get comfortable with Zoom, get comfortable with Teams, whatever kind of virtual setting that you're using. And that doesn't mean turn your camera off. This is a big thing that a lot of people default to that is disconcerting for me. Studies have shown that 93% of communication is nonverbal. How
okay.
you show up, your body
Yeah.
language, how you dress, how you interact with someone, the tone of your voice. Many people are now defaulting to text and email as a mode of communication. This is a very dangerous thing because there is no context to text.
Right.
That's a big problem. How many times have you received an SMS from someone where you thought, oh, what a jerk, and you chat with that person later, and you're like, hey, why are you being such a jerk? And the person's like, whoa, what are you talking about? You
Yes.
realize, of course, right? Like, there's no. I realize I misinterpreted that. That's on me, not on you. Now
Mhm.
we're leaving so much up to interpretation in a text-based negotiation
Yeah.
by
I
not
I
have.
actually sorry, I have a question on
Sure,
that.
go ahead.
What if the other party refuses to put their video on?
Yeah,
Like,
ask
how do
them.
you
First of
negotiate
all,
with
ask
somebody
them
like
to.
that?
Yeah, ask them to. So
Okay.
say, hey, can you turn on your camera, please? And then give them the reason why. Look, we're in a virtual setting. You don't know me as well as other people might, and I don't know you as well as people that you know might.
Right.
We're going to be developing a deal through the course of our conversations.
Mhm.
I'm old fashioned in that I want to be able to see that there's actually a person that I'm working with.
Mm.
Because a big part of this is you and I, if this deal goes well, we're going to have a relationship. And
Right.
I want to make sure that long term, that relationship is strong,
Yeah.
as I'm sure that you do too. A big part of that is for us to be able to see each other. So if you could turn your camera on, I would sincerely appreciate it. Now, look,
Love
if they're
that.
not camera ready and they say, look, I'm in my PJs, I'm not going to have this conversation on camera right now, you say, totally, I understand. For next time, because we're probably not going to get this deal done in one
Right.
sitting, for next time, can we agree that we'll turn our cameras on? Yes,
Mhm.
great, fantastic. I'll
Great
turn my
tips.
camera off, and then at least you're on both on even footing, and you can manage the conversation that way. But make sure that you try your best to get the counterparty to turn their camera on.
Love that. That's such great tips. All right, what's number 2? I'm, like, hanging on. I wanna know what number 2 is.
Yeah, the biggest thing is make sure that your environment matches how you want to be seen. Because
Okay.
impressions count and impressions matter. So when you're on camera, remember that people can see you, right? So be well groomed and make sure that you're talking properly, make sure your audio is good, but also make sure that your background environment matches how you want to be perceived.
Okay.
And if it's not set up a certain way, in much the same way that yours is and mine is, make sure that you adjust that and you blur out your background so that if you've got things that are in private or that you think you have things that you don't want people to see, that you don't want people to perceive you a certain way as, blur out your background. There have been several news broadcasts that we've all seen on the news where a background environment may include certain personal objects that we don't want people
Or
to see.
people.
Yeah, we don't want people to see, and so we want to blur that. Sure. Or and just make sure your environment matches that. So that's tip number 2, making sure
Right.
your environment matches that. The last tip, which I think is probably the single most important tip, is if the conversation is really important, record the conversation.
You know
Make
what? That's the
sure
one thing I forget to do all the time.
Yeah, and make sure that you record it and then give the transcript, right? Because you'll probably be able to produce an automatic transcript as a result. Give the transcript to the other person so that they have the notes. If you're negotiating a deal on an ongoing basis, you get to
Mm.
manage the minutes of that. You no longer need someone to take the minutes. You can have a recording of that conversation. Give that to the person, and that helps you to keep track of the conversation and what was discussed along the way.
I like that. I'm gonna implement that right now. Not like right now, but like in my conversations today. Because I always forget and then I'm halfway through and I'm like, you know what? I probably should have recorded this.
Right. And then we all forget to take really good notes. We think we're going to remember, and this is one of the major issues with a lot of negotiations. Most of us don't take great notes because we have this
Mm,
false sense of security that our memories are fantastic. Most of our memories are really fallible. They suck. And we need to make sure that we remember the conversations that we've had because we get to agreement formation time. We haven't taken good notes and then we're stuck. So recording the conversation allows us to bypass a lot of that.
well, I love this. So many great tips. So tell us about your services. How does it work? How can we work with you? What are the benefits of working with Negotiation Ninja? I mean,
Uh,
I think you've given tons of value already, so I don't even think we really need to go into the benefits, but I think maybe we do.
the biggest benefit that you're going to experience right now in today's day and age with inflation and supply chain issues that you have is risk reduction. That's the
Right.
biggest benefit that most of my clients are seeing today. Now, if you'd had this conversation with me a year ago, it would have been cost reduction as the biggest
Okay.
benefit that would have been seen. And cost management today is probably the biggest thing. But risk management is a big part because we need to manage risk in our agreements too. And the easiest way to get in touch with me is just to reach out to me on LinkedIn and connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you listened to this podcast in your invite, and then we can connect with each other and have a further conversation. But usually, what I do is I come in and do a training program with your team based on your business, and then we go into ongoing coaching where we maintain that training over a period of time.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because you have some big name partnerships with Nike and the US Army, and you do both individual and team training. Do
That's right.
you recommend one versus the other, or do you start with one and then lead into the other? What does that look like?
So we'll start with usually on-site training or virtual training, depending on your environment and
Right.
depending on how spread apart your team is. So if you have a global team, you've got a few people in North America, Europe, Asia. We generally do virtual training for each environment. And then we do ongoing coaching after that. The reason we do that is because we need to baseline the skill set. So
Okay.
baseline the skill set first, make sure that everyone understands how to negotiate first, and then coaching becomes much easier after that.
Yeah, well, and why it's important too, right? Because I
Yes.
mean, I think everybody really needs to understand in their role in the company why negotiation is important not only to the business but also to their individual role as well. And so setting that baseline, is that like half day training, full day training? Are we talking about like a week long?
It
Paint that
really
sort of
depends
picture.
on what the needs of the business are, but usually it's
Okay.
either if it's on site, it's a full 9 hour day where we do a crash course, or we'll break it up virtually and do 3.5 hours a day for 3 days consecutively. That's
Right.
usually the program that most people pick, but some people who have really advanced negotiation skills choose to do something that's really targeted. So we could do
Okay.
something that's a 4 hour session to level up that skill set. But the vast majority of leaders are saying, hey, look, my people just need to know how to negotiate. So come in
Yeah.
here and teach everyone how to negotiate, get them all at the same level, and then let's go from there.
And then sort of branch out. So paint us a picture of what that's looked like. When a customer has come to you, what was sort of the challenges that they were experiencing? What was the solution that you provided to them in this specific instance? And then what was the ROI or benefit that they saw specifically from working with you?
Yeah, so usually what ends up happening is a CPO would reach out to me and say, Mark, I have a problem. We are experiencing and it's usually it's exactly that conversation. We are experiencing massive cost increases with our business. The volume of work that we have is insane. We need to be able to negotiate faster, but also get better deals in place. That's
Mhm.
usually the first part of the conversation. Then we discuss what the primary needs are around facilitating the training, meaning like how is the team broken up? Are they junior people? Are they mid-level people? Are they senior people? Is it a mix? How do we split that up in the conversation? And then what skills are we going to teach them to deal with those problems?
Mhm.
Then we have the program that we tailor towards whatever team that we're working with, and then we deliver it, and then they start implementing right away. The big problem that a lot of people see and a lot of leaders see whenever they take any training, doesn't even matter if it's negotiation, is the retention rate dramatically drops off as soon as that training is done.
Ah,
So my job is to make sure that that retention rate stays really high, and then we implement coaching and consulting afterwards to make sure that that retention rate is really high. So we go coach ongoing after that, and then usually the ROI is made back within one deal, of course, because we're dealing with multi-million dollar contracts, and our training doesn't cost multi-millions. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And so your ROI is substantial almost immediately. You're going to see a massive risk reduction. You're going to start seeing massive cost management, and it's super beneficial for everyone in the organization. More than that, though, it starts to teach people how to think strategically about their relationships,
okay.
because most of us are going into relationships thinking, hey, this is a great relationship and this person's my friend and all that kind of stuff, and that's great, don't get me wrong. Personal relationships are good in business, but ultimately the point of that relationship is to drive profitability for the
Yeah,
business. So we've got to think more deeply about how we approach those relationships.
absolutely. And so do you have an ideal client? Like if I'm sitting here, maybe in a small business, obviously larger businesses because we're talking about multi-million dollar
Yeah.
contracts, but is there like an ideal client sort of threshold for you?
Yeah, I would say any business that has a team that needs negotiation skills that's over 12 people is usually where we are. And if you have a smaller team,
Perfect.
that's okay. But usually those smaller teams then bring in people from legal, they bring in people from sales to make up the size of that team. So if you can get 12 people together in a room, we're golden. We're ready to go, basically, and have that conversation. Um, the teams that I usually deal with are teams that are in excess of 30. So we usually break that up over multiple sessions and then do multiple training sessions. Some of the
Awesome.
large, so we do everything from basically like 20 people to 300 people, depending on how big your team is.
Okay, awesome. No, that's great. And I think if I read this properly, you have a procurement fundamentals program. And I think that's
We
something that's
do.
going to sort of pique the interest of nearly every buyer and category specialist out there. Can you tell us a little bit about that program?
Yeah, the Procurement Fundamentals program is really there to teach strat sourcing and category management at
Okay.
the most basic level to ensure that everyone understands how to actually do procurement.
Okay.
Because procurement and negotiation are sort of hand in glove, but they need to be taught independently. And so
Okay.
that program is very similar structure. We do that as well, depending on the organization for that same amount of people. But it's there to teach people how to negotiate, or sorry, how to do procurement a lot better.
Yeah, well, and I like that baseline, right? And I like the
Yeah,
fact that you're separating procurement and negotiation, but then sort of bringing them back together um, when you do the different training. So I
yeah.
really like that.
And
So what does Sorry, go ahead.
the reason we have it is because of what you said earlier. Like most of us in procurement and supply chain have kind of just fallen into it, right?
Yeah.
And we have no formal education on it, so that's why we developed the program, because most of us are learning on the job, and it's nice to get some formality to that.
Yeah, and even if you have experience too,
Yeah,
right? You can have experience in other environments, but there could be some best practices out there that you might not know about
right.
that you might want to get back to basics and sort of build on from there with the experiences that you've had. And since you've been in both procurement and negotiation, you can sort of help people navigate that as well, which I really like. What does the future hold for Negotiations Ninja? What can we sort of expect from you?
Whoa, we are experiencing some fantastic growth during this time, as you would expect, because everyone's going through major cost challenges right now, right? So everyone's like, how do I deal with this? We need someone to help us teach us how to negotiate. So That's been fantastic. It's been really good for our business, and so we're just growing and trying to move a lot of our stuff online. Probably the biggest part of our business is the extension. Our sister company is a company called Content Callout, which is a content marketing company that I started 2 years ago to help supply chain companies with their content marketing. Because what we
Awesome.
realized when we started Negotiations Ninjas, we built up that entire business with content, with
Mhm.
podcasts, with blogs, white papers, and case studies. And we thought, man, if we could do that for other people, that would be pretty cool. And so here we are 2 years later with a supply chain focused content marketing company, doing amazing things. So there's a lot going on. It's really exciting, and it's a fun time for us right now.
Awesome. Well, if the audience were to walk away thinking about or implementing something from this conversation, what would be the one thing that you would, really suggest that they walk away from this with?
Know what you need and know what you want. Start there. Don't do anything else until you deeply understand what you need and what you want. Once you understand that, everything else becomes easier. But do not even begin the conversation with anyone else without first understanding that.
I love that. And where can people find you? Give us
Easy,
all the links.
Easiest place is on LinkedIn. Just connect with me, Mark Raffan, or go to negotiations.ninja, or find me at Content Callout at contentcallout.com. And you can listen to our podcasts at Negotiations Ninja Podcasts or the B2B Content Marketing Show.
Love that. So that was really eye opening. I mean, so many takeaways, so much value. We haven't actually talked a lot about negotiation, and it's really an exciting area. Learning a new skill like this could be a game changer for supply chain professionals, procurement professionals, any professional really who's looking to close deals. But it's also important that we learn how to navigate a new norm and not just rely on what's worked in the past. So, thank you so much, Mark, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully, we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.